Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. We have a deal, folks. Woo. It has gone through the Senate. Sinema, after extracting her pound of flesh on behalf of the private equity industry, did sign on to the deal. It did pass through. It is actually expected to get through the House. So lo and behold, just when we thought that nothing was going to happen, there is something that's going through. So we'll break down the details. We'll tell you what Sinema stripped out, what she put in. There's also one piece on insulin prices specifically that the parliamentarian said, no, you can't do this, and Republicans ultimately blocked. So all those details we will bring to you. We also have some new moves from China. Retribution for Pelosi's big visit to Taiwan. Was it worth it? We will talk to you about that. We also, so this is very interesting.
Yes.
CBS News did this big report. They actually billed it as a documentary on the ground, tracking how few of the weapons that we ship to Ukraine actually get to the front line. So we thought, oh, this is very interesting.
Wow, great story.
We're going to cover it. We're going to show the clip. Well, days after this was posted online, they pulled it down. They've got all these caveats. We've got to investigate more. We've got to edit it. So you have the very first sort of like really critical deep dive from the media into exactly what is happening with these weapon shipments, and they're basically bullied into pulling it down.
Well, they were bullied specifically by the Ukrainian government, and so we're going to get into a lot of this. I've been looking over the details, just even more so this morning. It's genuinely shocking.
It is a pretty shocking story. Also, some genuine suspense in Washington. Democrats are now taking the tack of passing through the House and the Senate some of these pieces protecting these things to access to contraception, pieces regarding choice, and specifically on gay marriage. So the initial thought was that this was very, very unlikely to get through the Senate, actually codifying gay marriage. Now it looks like there's a possibility. So we'll talk to you about where that stands, what the whip count is, who's for it, who's against it. We also have some liberal love for Dick Cheney that we need to talk to you about. So we will get to all of those things. But let's start with, live show.
Live show. Oh, see, I forgot actually this time. Look at that. Atlanta. We are coming September 16th, 7:30.
Brain work to remember to plug it. There we go.
Thank you so much, Krystal. Recovering from some cross-country travel here, folks. So September 16th, 7:30 p.m. Atlanta. We are coming. We're going to have that live show. It's really exciting. As I said, go ahead and buy your tickets. We actually have a couple of mass ticket requests from a couple of patrons, so there really are not going to be all that many left after we go ahead and fulfill those. Grab the tickets while you still can. We're hoping to sell out the entire thing, maybe like a month or so ahead, just to show everybody else, yes, we can indeed sell out these venues so that we can book our tour. Negotiations are continuing right now. We're going to have a full list of tour for everybody as they come. So if you're in the area, we would deeply appreciate it, and we thank you all very much.
September 16th, Atlanta, Georgia. See you guys there.
Yes.
All right, let's get to the details of this deal that passed through the Senate over the weekend in a marathon session. Let's go ahead and put this first piece up on the screen. So it was a completely party line vote. Kamala Harris came in to be the tie-breaking vote, 51-50. Headline here from the New York Times: Senate passes climate and tax bill after marathon debate, despite all Republicans being opposed. The vote was a major victory for President Biden and Democrats. The bill now goes to the House, where it is expected to pass by the end of the week. You will recall, just to tell a little bit of the story of how we ended up here, you'll recall there was initially, a year ago, there were big negotiations around this Build Back Better bill. It included the climate piece. It included tax hikes on the rich and on corporations. It included a lot of social spending on childcare, elder care, and education and the like. Okay, this is a massively pared back version of that has now been rebranded by Joe Manchin as the Inflation Reduction Act. That's what he's calling it because that makes him feel good about himself, basically. Yeah. At the last minute, essentially the reporting indicates that Manchin didn't really like being the villain of the situation, especially in the elite press. So he comes back to Schumer and very quietly, totally behind closed doors with input from nobody and managing to keep it a total secret in Washington, Schumer and Manchin work out this deal. Basically what it entails is there are some sort of giveaways to appease the fossil fuel industry and to appease Joe Manchin and his ties to the fossil fuel industry, but there's also significant spending that will push us in the direction of clean energy. It would at least give clean energy kind of a shot, is how Ryan Grimm is describing it. You also have some significant tax increases on corporations. The original deal had some reforms. They didn't really close the carried interest loophole that's so beneficial to private equity, but there were some reforms to it that would constrain them, maybe possibly a little bit. The big piece was a 15%, what they call book tax on corporations over $1 billion. So these are giant companies, and you're going to look at their financial statements, what they're telling their investors versus the bullshit numbers that they send into the IRS to make sure they're at least paying something. So 15%, that actually raises significant revenue. You also have in there some additional money for the IRS so they could actually go after tax cheats, especially wealthy tax cheats. Right now, they don't really have the resources to do that. You have some closing of, or some continuation of Affordable Care Act subsidies, which were set to expire. That's also significant. You have something that Democrats have been after for a very long time, which is Medicare being able to negotiate on prescription drug prices. That should be a benefit to seniors who are on the Medicare program. And those are kind of the big pieces. So that was the original Manchin-Schumer deal. Kyrsten Sinema, though, she had to have her say. And of course, she had to go in there and make this thing worse and make sure she's taking care of specifically her private equity buddies, which seems to be her.
It's not a joke. Literally, there's only two things that she has stood on. First is the private equity initial nixing, and then during the vote itself, causing a hell of a lot of drama and actually making things worse for every other industry except for private equity.
Yes.
It's kind of amazing.
So let's go ahead and put this Politico tweet up on the screen. So let me walk you through all the pieces that Kyrsten Sinema demanded. Some of it is unobjectionable and some of it is highly objectionable. First thing, as I said, she removed the carried interest reform altogether. So they were only tinkering around the edges of this. Some of the theories were that they put this in specifically so that she could strip it out and claim a win. That is a major giveaway to the private equity industry. So Kyrsten Sinema goes ahead and makes sure she does that for them. Now, she had to replace that revenue. And actually, what she put in there instead was a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks, which would ultimately raise more revenue than the kind of bullshit carried interest loophole reform thing that they were doing. So even though it's a grotesque giveaway to the private equity industry, that part I didn't have as much of an issue with on balance. Another thing she did that I didn't have an issue with is $5 billion in drought relief, which disproportionately benefits her state of Arizona, but fine. I mean, that's spending that is worthwhile that we need to be dealing with, okay. Another thing that she claimed to be concerned about is, now let's get into this 15% book tax. So there are two pieces here. Number one, she claimed that some manufacturing concerns were saying, oh, this is going to discourage us from investment. We need to be able to still take our depreciation for our investments in property, plant, and equipment. So they modified that so that it's not really 15% minimum tax. They can still take some additional depreciation and other credits beyond that to get that tax rate, again, below 15%. But the real doozy was yet another private equity industry giveaway that Sinema really delivered on. So I'm going to get into the details of this and try not to make it so that your eyes glaze over. But effectively, for those of you guys who know, private equity companies, they buy a bunch of other businesses, oftentimes sort of like, you know, load them up with debt, strip them of their, sometimes sell them for parts. But they're holding a bunch of different companies. So the question was, okay, well, if all of these companies you own together is more than the $1 billion threshold for this 15%, well, this should apply to you. Oh, no. She wasn't going to have private equity subject to this 15%, which again is still very low, tax. So at the last minute in the voting with the amendment, she partnered with a few other Democrats and all the Republicans to make sure that private equity would be unaffected by the 15% book tax.
Yeah, it's completely outrageous, Krystal, because what this means is that firms like Apollo Global Management, which used to be headed by Leon Black, since resigned after his connections to Epstein, but just to give you an idea of who some of these people are.
Side note there.
Just a little side note about who some of the biggest global private equity people are in America. Disproportionately multi-billionaires. You know, these people buy up these companies, leverage them up with debt, offshore. They're some of the worst people in American finance, and they benefit from some of the biggest loopholes in the American tax code. Well, this was the first time that we were ever actually going to go after them. And one of the benefits of the way that the book tax was written was, what is the easy way? Is if they say, we're going to tax everybody over $1 billion. What do? They spin off a bunch of subsidiary companies, and they have holdings that eventually totaled up past $1 billion. But according to the IRS and legalese, they could say that they report under $1 billion. did. This actually was quite strict in the way that they were going to enforce said law. And it's one of the reasons why it would have raised so much money. What she effectively did is carve out the private equity industry from the 15% minimum tax. So what does this mean? It actually disincentivizes normal corporations, which are much easier to regulate, much easier to go ahead and to tax. And this actually is such a boon that it is very likely that we are going to see even more sales to the private equity industry because they have such a beneficial carve out now in the tax code. So this is a tax code boon to some of the worst people in the U.S. economy. So now, not only are they going to pay less in income tax than you or I as small business owners, and maybe even more so than a lot of people who pay even just basic payroll taxes, but now they actually now have a specific benefit over the rest of the industry thanks to Krystal Sinema. It's one of the most insane tax carve out. It's totally indefensible.
It is grotesque.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just so brazen. Yeah. This will save the private equity industry $35 billion over the next decade. This is a $4 trillion industry in the United States, and we're talking about this small sliver of people who have, I mean, they just have completely bought Krystal Sinema. And this is the thing is, you know, lobbying money well spent, I guess. Whatever they spent to get her on their side, it was certainly worth it in terms of their bank accounts and this grotesque giveaway that they ultimately won for her. It really is extraordinary. And let me tell you what she's saying, the bullshit spin on this, and what John Thune, the Republican who offered up this grotesque amendment.
He's a great friend of the industry.
Yeah, and all the Republicans voted for, a few of the Democrats, and Krystal Sinema led the charge here. So they're saying, oh, it could be read, this tax code, so that these small businesses themselves could be impacted by the 15% minimum book tax. And that's just not fair, just because they happen to be owned by private equity. Well, every analyst that they spoke to said, no, that is not the way this works. Right. Now, if that really is your concern, we could clarify that in the language, but that was not really their concern. What they wanted was a fig leaf of a justification to give this giant giveaway to private equity.
Yeah, this thing came at the 11th hour. This actually came only hours before the vote. It scrambled the entire process. They had to find a different way to go ahead and to pay for it. So she threw this in at the wrench because she was throwing it, completely holding the deal hostage. And this is so egregious. Even Joe Manchin spoke out against some of this. Put it up there
even Joe
on the
Manchin's
screen.
like, dang,
he was like, I'm very disappointed that she took this out. The carried interest, not even loophole, like a one-year extension of carried interest, is they'll admit it. It's a heck of a run that they just can't justify. He's right. There is no justification for many of the rich carve-outs that we have in our tax code, both from billionaire individuals to also the tax code. And I do think it is remarkable. And this, you know, look, I think there's some things in this bill which are really, really great. But there was a tweet this morning which effectively shows Democrats have now had two opportunities to repeal the Trump tax cuts of 2017. I will remind the audience, the single most unpopular thing Donald Trump ever did in office, Charlottesville, January 6th, he never reached a lower point in his presidency than the day that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed as a giveaway to rich people, giveaway to the industry, accelerating stock buybacks, not putting us in the best position in whenever the coronavirus pandemic hit, because lo and behold, everybody spent a bunch of money on stock buybacks. Nobody spent any money on actually, you know, manufacturing and investment. That remains codified into law. So we now have two successive Republican administrations, the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, which Democrats ran against and promised to repeal and did not do so. They had multiple opportunities, and it now remains the law of the land. And we all know the House going the way it's going to go, that means that they're here to stay forever. And if Trump wins, then we're going to have even more tax cuts.
It's done. I mean, and this is common, as you're pointing out with the Bush tax cut. There's a ratchet effect, which once you do the giveaway to the rich, they are never letting it go. They will do whatever they can. They will buy whoever they need to make sure that they lock in their little giveaway, their little loophole, the thing that makes it so that they pay so little in taxes compared to the percentage rate that you pay, that small business owners pay, that ordinary taxpayers pay. It really, really is grotesque. Couple other things to say here. So first of all, obviously this has to also pass through the House, where the big question mark was over the no salt, no dice caucus. I saw this morning that they're saying they're going to back bracket. So they were not willing to be like the total villains of the situation. Even Josh Gottheimer had enough sense to be like, all right, fine, I'll back this thing. And Manchin had kind of drawn a red line about the SALT tax cap, saying we're not getting rid of this. So it would have been a problem if they tried to mess around with it. They've said they're on board. I haven't seen any progressives who were saying they're not going to vote for it. So it looks very likely that this is going to go through the House and ultimately end up on the president's desk. I'm going to talk in my monologue a little bit about, the media coverage is very like historic.
Hagiography.
It's landmark.
Yes.
It's the first this is the best week in his presidency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to downplay the deal because there are good things in it.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah,
it's a good thing.
I think we spent some time last week really going through the provisions, what it means for you specific. There's a lot that's actually very good in it for consumers in terms of that would both reduce our emissions, but also really, be a direct benefit to you. If you're able to buy an electric vehicle, there's a big, subsidy for a tax credit for that, for making your home more energy efficient, those sorts of things.
Home solar.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not a fan of corporate solar, but home solar is good.
Yeah, home solar installation, all those sorts of things which are beneficial. The 15% minimum book tax, even if Krystal and Sinema gave this giveaway to private equity, it still is an improvement. It still is going to raise revenue. It still is going to make it so that you won't see as often companies like Amazon paying 0% interest rate, which is a good thing.
Right. I'll just reiterate those, which is that effectively there's been $80 billion for electric vehicle subsidies. And actually, one of the things I like the most about it is that for a while, GM and Tesla were actually penalized by the tax code because they had sold more than 200,000 vehicles. And originally they capped it so that you no longer got an EV tax credit for buying those vehicles. But look, it's not about, 200,000 or less. It should be a boon to the entire American electric vehicle market. And so that tax credit is going to come back under this. Part of the ones actually that could help the most people, you may not even really feel it, but you will feel it at the installation level, is some money off for electric cooktops and also money off for electric panels and home insulation. These are little things which of course bleed into your air conditioning bills and more and make it a little bit better. So all of these are going to be written into the tax code and on the margins, they're going to help your ability in order to reduce energy consumption. Now, obviously we have a hell of a lot way to go, but it does look, like I said, the fact that we got technology neutral into this. A lot of right-wingers are not talking about it because this bleeds into the bigger culture war. I do kind of wish they hadn't called it the Inflation Reduction Act because it's like, guys, come, this has nothing to do with inflation. Stop. It's fine. It's a climate bill. Honestly, calling it a clean energy bill is not the worst thing in the world. Like, it's not like clean energy is unpopular.
I mean, this was Manchin.
Yeah.
You can put this squarely on Manchin. The naming of it, this is what he needed to make it called in order to be able to sell it, because he's been saying like his whole thing is, inflation, and this is what he's focused on.
Whatever.
To the extent that over a number of years it will reduce your costs, I guess technically it will reduce inflation. But is it set to deal with inflation right? No, that's not really the main focus of the bill.
Anyway, there's some good provisions. We should celebrate them. I think it's a good thing. I'm annoyed, specifically about the private equity.
It really is gross.
I just can't imagine being a United States senator at the last hour and going and holding this whole thing hostage just so a specific billionaire industry can get such a massive tax carve-out.
Yeah.
And look, a lot of the Republicans who voted for this, a lot of these guys talk a big game about, we're going to go after BlackRock and Larry Fink and all that. It's like, yeah, well, you just voted to give the guy a tax cut. So congratulations.
He led the charge.
He's actually a lot richer now, thanks to you.
Because she couldn't have done it with just Democrats.
Yeah, of course.
They weren't on board.
Right.
I mean, and the other thing about it is she got her drought relief thing for Arizona. At least you can look at that and be like, that's your state.
Yeah.
Like, you're actually, even freaking Josh Gottheimer, as gross as it is, his salt cap thing, that actually does impact his constituents very directly.
They're rich. So, he's like, I'm fighting for you.
He's like, this is my constituent, and this is what I'm standing for.
Right.
But like, the private equity industry is in New York and Connecticut. This isn't even in her. These are just the people that she's serving who aren't even her constituents who have bought her off. It is grotesque. The last thing I want to say on the overarching sweep of the bill, and then we'll get into this other piece on insulin, which is also very important, is obviously, even though the media is billing this as landmark, historic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it is a far cry from what the original conception of Build Back Better was, especially on the social spending. But also just if you look at the climate portion, it's nowhere near the sweep, the scope, the amount of spending that they were contemplating to begin with. And of course, there's basically at this point, very little in here that's going to impact your healthcare costs. Very little that's really going to get at the prescription drug pricing, especially after the parliamentarian made a couple of negative rulings regarding what they could do with regard to prescription drug pricing. Of course, pre-K child tax credit, elder care, housing, all that stuff ultimately left out. And Bernie Sanders, ultimately all the Democrats obviously voted for it, otherwise it wouldn't have gotten through. But he offered a number of amendments that I thought was kind of revealing, because there were a few things, I'm going to talk about this some in my monologue too, like the child tax credit that supposedly every single Democrat supports, and yet for whatever reason they're like, no, we can't possibly put it in this bill. It's like, well, then do you really support it? Because ultimately, look, I get it's a precarious balance and, you know, you're striking a deal here and whatever, but it's grotesque that Kyrsten Sinema can hold it hostage for her private equity giveaway. But when Bernie's like, hey guys, we all support the child tax credit and this is really great for kids, why don't we put this in? Every single Democrat, every single senator except for Bernie votes against it. So I think it's important to keep into context what the original idea was, what the original conception was, and the much, 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 much more narrow version that ultimately gets through, while still saying, yes, it's a victory, yes, it's a positive step forward, even with the caveats, it's an improvement over the status quo.
Definitely. Politically, do I think it will matter? Honestly, no. I mean, to the extent that it will have like a little bit of a boost, maybe to some Democrats, like, yeah, okay. I just think macroeconomically, inflation is a story. We'll probably cover it tomorrow. Poll out today just shows Joe Biden 60% disapproval, which, you know, okay, look, you've had your good week, but when you're coming off something like that, listen, Jimmy Carter had a number of legislative wins too. It didn't actually matter.
Yeah, yeah, and the problem is that Democrats really need to shift the status quo of reality, not just like have a couple of good media cycles.
Yes.
You know, it's the problems are so far beyond just like, oh, you have a messaging issue. So cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.